And we're live from Austin, Texas, Pleb Lab. This is only the third podcast in Ideas from the Edge, but it's the second in one day. So busy day. Super stoked to have Christopher David, one of the leading thinkers at the edge of open source AI, Nostr, the Lightning Network, and a founder that I'm excited to have backed out of HiveMind, who's exploring the frontier of what an open agent world looks like. How's it going, Chris?
Quite good, Max. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. So as you know, on Ideas from the Edge, we talk about whatever's on your mind. So nothing is too crazy. I'm sure we'll talk about open source. I'm sure we'll talk about AI, whatever esoteric things are all fair game. I want to start with you though. You've had a really interesting background. Obviously pre-AI, you worked on, cooperatives and open source software, Nostr, all kinds of cool stuff. You mentioned to me when we first met in Costa Rica about a year and a half ago, a book which was from the pirate party called Swarmwise. And you said, this is kind of your manifesto. Why do you love this book? What's the takeaway?
So this book, which anyone listening can download for free online, Google Swarmwise PDF, written by Rick Falkvinge about a decade ago. Rick was the founder of the Swedish pirate party, the first pirate party, which this book chronicles the rise of the pirate party, how it began with basically a single manifesto, hastily written blog post draft thing that he posted to one bulletin board that went viral overnight, got like inbound press, people calling him the next day, journalists and stuff, as he put forward this manifesto about launching this pro piracy, civil liberties political party, and it went completely viral. But the subtitle to the book is The Tactical Manual to Changing the World. And it's kind of summed up by the opening quote in the very beginning. It says, "Your most powerful asset is not the employees that work for you," said someone to the manager. "Your most powerful asset is the thousands of people that want to work for you for free, and you won't let them." It was all about the power of the crowd, and by like putting a bold banner in the ground, there's all sorts of people around the world that agree with you and want to help you if you give them a way to do that. So it was all about lessons that he learned and sort of this sort of science that he's distilled around releasing control of things that you might otherwise think that you need to control, things like the brand and the logos, like by encouraging and incentivizing like crowdsourced participants to come at you. They were able to do things like get a level of cost per vote that was like orders of magnitude better than the established political parties that were super well funded, and they like won seats in the European Parliament on this model. And what was exciting for me is, number one, seeing that as sort of like a distillation of things that I had observed in my past as doing grassroots political organizing through the Students for Ron Paul movement in 2008, 2012. Various things with the Ron Paul campaign, where that campaign was also a perfect example of the power of this crowdsourcing. All these like memes and things, just because like Ron Paul, this like crotchety old sweet Texas grandpa, stood on stage and was like, "No, actually 9/11 was blowback," and here just like dismantling all these like standard warmonger Republican neocon talking points. And just like, I was one of those people in May of 2007 during that South Carolina Republican debate. I mean, I was a Democrat at the time. I was like anti-war. I was like, I can't bring myself to vote for John Kerry, but let's tune in to see what these like neocon Republicans are saying. And like, wait a second, there's a Republican who's more anti-war than the Democrats? What's going on here? And so I'm one of many people who sort of, that was my spark that got me falling down the rabbit hole of libertarianism and Austrian economics and getting involved with that movement, where people from around the world were creating signs and logos, and the like backwards love logo of the Ron Paul Revolution. Like all of that was completely crowdsourced. And then unfortunately, when you zoom to the following election of 2012, and then the election after that, 2016, Rand Paul, it's like this beautiful spark that sparked a movement in 2008, raised money, attracted consultants. In 2012, the consultants basically tried to systematize the things that the community had done by like in 2008 organizing these like quote unquote money bombs, where like the community would all donate on a single day that would make the news. And the campaign tried to like systematize that, but it was this all like kind of imposition of a top-down control structure, and Ron Paul 2012 as a campaign never took off, and not to the extent that '08 did. And then, furthermore, in 2016, I was involved also with the Rand Paul campaign, but again, just like the enthusiasm, the grassroots enthusiasm had died down because the consultants had got their hooks in, and just like Rand didn't even make it to New Hampshire, like dropped out. So, but there was something there that, in my view, like was something worth studying. Like, what is the power of the crowd? This had been best articulated by this book. I haven't seen anything articulated better. And a thing that I've been like trying to do in sort of my approach to business and entrepreneurship since then has been like, what are ideas that can be applied from this book and applied to entrepreneurial opportunities? And in the case of Uber, where drivers, at least 2015, 2016, 2017, were being really systematically taken advantage of by Uber in all sorts of different ways. But it's like, here's an opportunity for me to plant a flag in the ground and say, like, no, actually, drivers deserve the right to transact peer-to-peer. They deserve to set their own rates. They deserve to drive even in the face of some government banning them. And so that was enough for me to have my own moment in January of 2016, where, I put up a little manifesto and we did some stuff kind of on the wrong side of the law in New Hampshire, fighting back against this Uber ban. And we got our, on the local news and the state news, and kind of had a sort of a mini version of the same thing that happened to Falkvinge happen also to us. And we I made videos where I showed the Swarmwise book, and 4 or 5 months after that initial burst, after Uber and Lyft pulled out of Austin in May of 2016 on 48 hours notice, putting 10,000 drivers out of a job essentially overnight. We came here, we built up a network of 10,000 people in the first week, had these rider and driver meetups, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but all of a sudden Rick Falkvinge got our address and sent us a whole box of the books that we handed them out at our driver meetup. So cool. We've been trying to kind of invoke that organizing thesis and bottle it up, which we're now trying to do kind of a version of that, pushing back against OpenAI. More on that soon, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll get to AI. I'm curious, in this 2008 Ron Paul campaign, it seems to me like there's a lot of magic associated with that, both, for sort of some of these crowdsourcing ideas and also Bitcoin. On the crowdsourcing point, what is it that really worked, or what was that lightning in a bottle you had in '08 that wasn't there in 2012? Was it a specific idea? Was it a way of spreading the message? What changed?
The money bomb was ideated by the community.
Yeah.
And it caught on in the community. People made memes and YouTube videos. Eventually, Ron at some event would mention it. And it was just kind of this thing that grew and achieved this result that was the largest single day fundraising in history or whatever. And then the community came together to organize and do an even bigger one. And it was bottom up. It was something that some people thought was a good idea, and where people just felt like if they did not add their voice to spread this message, it wouldn't get spread. And so you had people set up factories in their whatever random warehouse they had access to, where they're mass manufacturing these banners out of fabric and spray paint. They say Ron Paul Revolution, and then hanging them up over overpasses. Just levels of commitment to get that message out in a way that you just don't see that often at all. And then, yeah, that sort of dynamic being not respected at all in 2012. And I wrote a whole blog post about this 8 years ago. I should dredge up, where I kind of take aim and criticize the Rand Paul campaign for doing the opposite of these things. That might be worth dredging up for historical reasons. But basically, you need to allow space for people to express themselves and let them feel empowered that you are sort of kind of delegating agency and spokesmanship to those people. So they're not waiting for what the central committee or the central candidate does.
Yeah. One other thing that I've noticed is it seems like there was, and it makes sense ideologically, a lot of overlap between the Ron Paul campaign people and Bitcoiners. Did you see that shortly after the Ron Paul campaign? Did you see a lot of people get into Bitcoin early on, or in 2012, was there already a lot of sort of adoption and usage there?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was a lot, but there was definitely Bitcoiners in that crowd, and that was how I got introduced to Bitcoin in 2011. Just one of my fellow organizers
Crazy.
Mentioned like, hey, you should check out Bitcoin, and because this could be like an answer to the central bank issues, and I remember my question was like, oh, it's at $30, it just rose up to from 4, like, do you think it's going to keep going up? And my friend was like, eventually. I was like, all right. I bought 30 coins at $30, then I crashed down to $2. I'm like, well, shit, maybe next time. And then woke up like 2 years later and, oh, it's at 200 now. Sold most of it and kind of kicking myself ever since. But yes, absolutely. That was definitely fertile ground for, the sort of intersection between Bitcoiners and libertarians or Austrian economists. One of the kind of downsides there was a lot of the early Bitcoin adoption happened in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And you had Roger Ver and you had, but one of the problems that emerged there was, this is a group of very kind of intransigent, hardcore minded people who, some of those people got really dramatically infected by the talking points of like the block size war. And now, I mean, you fast forward to today and you'd be hard pressed to identify any real Bitcoin maxi community there. It's a lot of shitcoiners or people who think, or they made their bags in some like shitcoin years ago. And so it's an interesting community, but not hasn't really kept up with the times in some ways.
Yeah, no, it's funny. And I certainly have seen that as well, where, I actually thought at one point, and this may still be the case, I'm curious if you would agree with this, where perhaps one of the highest expected value jobs of the last 20 years was being on the Ron Paul campaign. Would you agree with that? If you held, I guess.
I mean, the campaign, maybe not, because a bunch of us were kind of broke to start with. No, it was the people who were libertarian but had enough money, like Roger did from entrepreneurial success, to like make a big bet on it because you were so inclined. And fortunately, there's enough like really solid early people, libertarians and such, who got well funded. And so, I mean, I think the sort of libertarian movement today is in a really good position. Haven't yet succeeded in having anything close to real political power, but at least it's nice to see some of those ideas be adopted by, as recently as the Trump campaign now saying that they're going to free Ross on day one. Like, that's a crazy, huge thing that the libertarians have been making noise about for a decade. And to have a former president say he's going to free Ross Ulbricht on day one, legendary.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Cool. So you had a really interesting, set of backgrounds. You obviously, I know for those of you who don't know, you worked on the ride sharing stuff and you originally had some Ethereum stuff. You got out of that, came back to Bitcoin. When I met you, you were very focused on Nostr. And so we actually met in Costa Rica at Nostrica, and you had a lot of interesting ideas around messaging. When we first met, in fact, I think when I first decided, I wanted to back the idea you're working on, it was more like a Nostr super app, messaging app. And then, a couple months go by, AI starts kind of taking off, and you're like, actually, no, we need to go all in on AI. I tend to agree with that. I am curious why. What led you to believe that this is the moment you want to go all in on AI? Why is this what you've become obsessed with over the last year and a half?
It started with a frustration that I felt trying to take the new innovations that came out, and particularly like the new cool uncensored AI models that I wanted to experiment with. At the time, it was to add some sort of cool AI chat into the Nostr-based chat app that we were building. And trying to go get compute GPUs to run these models was almost impossible. So hard. You go to Amazon Web Services that usually has a bunch of these, and they say, oh, there's a 5-day wait list to get approved to raise your quota to get one of these instances. Like, what? And you get a hugging face and like, oh yeah, spin it up. Oops, like we're out of hardware capacity. And it's like, why is this thing called GPU compute so supply constrained? And specifically, where is the marketplace that I can pay 3, 5, 10x above spot if I want to, and I really need a GPU? Like, where's the marketplace, and why does that not exist? So that was the original idea for the sort of initial pivot to AI, is like, there should be a liquid marketplace of compute that I can just pay in the ideal native currency of the internet called Lightning, optimized for micropayments, and just pay that. So that was the initial version of my like sort of pivot to AI number one. That was successful in some ways. Like we built software that connected any number of consumer devices, consumer GPUs, as well as of the more powerful NVIDIA ones into a network that sat underneath an OpenAI compatible API endpoint that supported, by the time we finished with it, like inference, fine tuning, image generation, and embeddings, all in this like completely decentralized network that paid its providers in Lightning sats. We succeeded tremendously in attracting sellers. Tons of people love the idea of like monetizing their compute that's just sitting around. We did not succeed in attracting buyers. And that had me start to like take a broader look at the AI market as it was and say like, okay, where are the actual use cases that people are paying for? Now, one thing that our network was not optimized for as a compute provider was competing pound for pound with some of the many GPU infrastructure companies that specialized in that were in many cases subsidized by venture dollars and like doing this crazy race to the bottom of prices that we were not really able to compete in, given that the quality of service that our decentralized network had was not able to match what they had. They were driving prices down. It's like, now, if we had leaned into the thing that we had been clearly good at, which is kind of having a somewhat reliable way to serve these open or uncensored models, sure, we probably could have built a successful business doing some sort of like AI waifu uncensored. Like if we pivoted to porn, I'm sure we would have made a whole bunch of money. But that's not what I'm trying to do with my life. So, but that really got me thinking like, where are the buyers and like, what are people actually paying for? And then the big light bulb for me came in watching the OpenAI Dev Day presentation in November of 23, where Sam Altman kind of like led through the GPT-4 upgrades and things they were doing. And his sort of like one more thing, his like cherry on top at the end was, we're going to be launching this GPT store. We think that he kind of hinted at that the future was going to be AI agents, and that this was going to be them taking one step in that direction by providing a way for anybody, even a non-developer, to create a very basic version of an agent. They call them GPTs, and have them listed and implying it's called store, obviously, that there'd be some commerce here where people would be purchasing these GPTs. And I made a video the next day and I said, folks, we're going to do our own version of this, because my prediction is that they are going to half-ass the monetization. They'll probably do something like the X-style creator monetization payouts, where they'll have some subset of users, if they qualify and meet some criteria, be paid once a week in Stripe Connect, and the rest of the world, India or wherever else, will be screwed or come around to them later. That ended up being correct. In fact, 6+ months later, their GPT store has never had any monetization, and as far as we can tell, has not made a single payout to a developer. So I underestimated how much they would not deliver on what they said they would do. But that idea that I had originally was like, okay, let's take this idea of like paying Bitcoin Lightning sats to people for services provided and apply this to actual agents. What I've since come to believe, number one, is particularly, in the months since then, companies like Google, Microsoft, certainly OpenAI, and a whole bunch of other like startups, but like well-funded companies are building their own agents. And like the headline from this one information article that came out recently was like, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI view agents as the key to unlocking enterprise spending. Like, enterprises may have been doing some things with Gen AI, but largely there have been, I've seen plenty of complaints on my timeline about a whole bunch of the sort of like enterprise procurement people like being burned out from all of the fake promises, hypes, demoware, and like what the hell is this? Lots of grand promises, but nothing has really like delivered on the promise of this. But the sort of thinking is that it's not just the models or stuff that you can do with models that is going to be what businesses are going to want. It's going to be some combination of the new models paired with maybe more traditional or boring versions of business process optimization and the kinds of things that a business might engage a Zapier or an Airtable for, but like augmented with AI. And the name that everyone has landed on for describing this is agents. So we've certainly seen that there's the market is sort of moving in the direction of agents. I'm seeing people in VCs on my timeline complain now that like every pitch they're getting is about agents. So everyone's talking about it now. I just want to make the point that we made a bet on this earlier than all of you people did. We like being early on this stuff.
You also secured one hell of a domain.
Openagents.com. We had to pay a little bit of money for it, but I think that ended up being good. But, I began this sort of like what's now a 97 video tweet thread calling it Open Agents. And that was when we were still called GP Utopia. But, about a month into that process, realized that we wanted to bet fully on Open Agents. So, got the Delaware C Corporation and the .com are both available. So we became Open Agents after that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Ton of questions on AI. I guess my first question to you is, I think both of us are ideologically aligned and commercially aligned on wanting to see open source win. What is your current view of sort of the state of the market with AI? And like, obviously open source models were lagging quite good, lagging maybe a year, maybe 2 years max behind the really big sort of hyperscaler models. Facebook starts, or Meta training Llama, which is quite good and can finally match the old ChatGPT-4 model. Where do you think we are, and like, how do you think this evolves over time? I'm sure you saw the recent Founders Fund dude who's basically saying no, like it's going to be, closed source models are going to race ahead again in the future because the training costs are so expensive and they need to amortize that, and their shareholders are not going to let them just like open source the next big llama. It seems like Zuck, was obviously kind of commoditizing the compliment at first, maybe won't open source the next big one. What is your thought on how all this evolves?
Well, first to recap the big events of the last month or so, the sort of, I would say, morale of the open source AI community probably hit the high point right after Llama 3 came out, seeing that they launched a very powerful model, open weights, that was basically pound for pound, more or less equivalent to GPT-4. So the first kind of open source GPT-4-ish equivalent, absolutely huge, as well as the news that Meta was also working on a, 400B model that's just going to be like huge. Now, some difficulty there around like thinking about how to host that in like an open source decentralized way, but at least there'd be like conceivably this just like massive firepower, and like finally the open source community has like the most powerful weapons on our side. And, even though, so there's been some necessary speculation about like what have Zuck's motives been. And I found his rationale pretty convincing on the Dwarkesh podcast, where he laid out how, them making this big bet on open source it's strategic for them. It like drives their costs down. And in the past, when they've made big bets on open source, it's like they build such a developer community and they are able to take the developments and fold them into their own products. And like they save so much money on the improvements that they get from that. Like it actually makes sense for their bottom line. The concern is that will there come a point when that is not the case? Hopefully not, particularly if they're able to remain sort of the darling of the open source AI movement. So to that point, the open source community has sort of really been able to factor in the new Llama models as sort of like being on our team. Like we can take these models, we can do different things to fine tune them and such, and like keep us on par collectively with what the closed labs are doing. That got kind of some cold water splashed on the face of that reaction when one of the main like open AI leaker accounts, which, you have to take this with a grain of salt given that they are competing. But one of these accounts that's like been somewhat reliable in the past about like giving predictions. They clearly have some sort of inside information. And they made a pretty authoritative post a week or two ago, like, yeah, like they're actually not going to be open sourcing the weights of this, in part because of like Dustin Moskovitz is off like scaring the hell out of people that this could be a safety concern, and there's people that are listening to that. And then like Jan LeCun will kind of like press back. So there's now like some concern that like, like if Team Open loses the open weights of Zuck, of Meta, even if it's just some of their models, is like that's a potential negative sign. There's still no clarity around exactly how that's going to go. And then you've got things like Mistral has been one of the darlings of open source AI. How cool they are that they release their models via torrent and all this great marketing. And they've got their kind of like hosted version, and we happily integrate that into OpenAgents. That's one of the models. In fact, I think the main model when you go to openagents.com as a free user that you're using is Mistral Small. Like we love Mistral, have loved Mistral. But they have the hosted version, but they also have released the weights of like the 7B and Mistral and Mixtral and some of the majority of the open source excitement kind of in the lull period between Llama 2 and Llama 3 was the community taking and using Mixtral and Mistral and making all sorts of different remixes and hosting it in different places. And companies like Grok have been able, GROQ, not to be confused with Elon's one, have like taken Mistral and hosted it super fast. And like there's all these different people like using their models. Well, it comes out today that their new code model that they just released has a new non-production license associated with it where you cannot deploy it to production. It's for R&D only. And then like the founder gives some mealy-mouthed explanation about why they're doing this because they want to balance this with that. But like, who just invested a bunch of money into Mistral? Microsoft, the fucking evil empire. They're the basically owners of OpenAI. They got 49% of OpenAI. Or above, and like they basically own the hell out of OpenAI. They're making the biggest sort of like tendril-y acquisitions, and their influence is clearly toward closed source. And it's like open source might fall behind here. Yeah. This is potentially dire. If every conference like this AI engineer summit, I went to the last year's, and like I get these emails now like, oh, our founding sponsor leading the way on AI is Microsoft. Fuck you. Microsoft is the evil empire. We need to take them down. And so look, if there's no one else to say that, I'll say it. Fuck you, Microsoft. We're not taking your money. We're going to fucking end you. And here's what it's going to look like. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. Sorry to put myself in that shoes, but Satya, we're coming for you. We're coming for your empire. We're going to carve it up. And you've got a whole fucking hive mind of bees coming at you. So game on.
I can see you're obviously very passionate about that. What do you think? So like, okay, depending on how you look at this, one thing that I've always been very bullish on is, even if some of the open source models are a little bit, whatever, a year behind or whatever, the ability to openly string those things together, which is what largely you're working on with open agents, means that, you have potentially way more horsepower because you have lots of, potentially fine-tuned trained models that are really good at one things. And that kind of jives with my own view of intelligence. Obviously, we've chatted and you've, you were referencing the other day sort of my thesis on how AI is going to evolve in the way that most organisms evolve, lots of specialized things cooperating together. And that is my sort of long-term sort of view. What I maybe, worry about in the short term is if some of these hyperscalers, the next generations of models that they put out are so far ahead. Even then in the long run, I feel like open source will catch up because there is some like diminishing return to more data or more compute or more electricity, which are the potentially limiting sources. But I think the big question in my mind is where in the S curve are we? Is that something that's going to happen, next year, in 10 years, in 20 years? What is your best sense of where we are in the S curve for training the hyperscaler models and what the actually scarce resource is? Is it compute? Is it data? Is it electricity? All of the above.
The consensus from the largest closed labs is that the scaling laws are still holding. So you're going to continue to have companies like Microsoft seeing that as reason enough to do the largest, as I've heard someone describe, their current data center build out is like the single largest infrastructure data center build out in history to build GPUs for training new models. So there will certainly continue to be that. I think maybe the economics of that level of build out may hit diminishing returns before actual scaling laws kick in, where, and this, you don't know how true this is, but one of the kind of like rumors floating around is that there's some conversation about someone internal to Microsoft who is saying that they were kind of freaking out on how to get more than 100,000 H100s on the same compute load because they can't put more than 100,000 in the same state or they'll like bring power grids down. So I think there will be companies bumping up against the just like economics and physics of our current like system. And I like kind of speculating about how maybe the architecture of, for example, the Bitcoin network of miners that are already doing this energy arbitrage all around the world and have data centers. You know, you already start to see miners starting to diversify into AI infrastructure. And if there are ways of having training workloads meaningfully split between data centers, or not even needing to do that, but just have data centers do some piece of a model that gets used. Like, I think that there's a lot potentially that the Bitcoin community could be well positioned to do in partnership with the open source AI community. Certainly, at least as sort of a backup that's been of interest to me. If right now some of my business value to customers is reliant on third-party APIs that could be turned off, I would love to be able to know that I can always eject with the latest open model and like rebuild everything on a purely Bitcoin, compute network that's not going to be able to be censored by anybody. It's nice to know that. But I think that all of that is going to kind of happen sort of in the background over the next number of years. It doesn't matter how fast people build data centers. All that stuff takes time to come online. And so even though I think you're going to continue seeing relatively dramatic or historic ramp ups of builds of data centers over the next few years, and like a whole lot of dollars are going to keep going into this, I don't think the battle will be for long at the level of base models, because I think regardless of where they're coming from, those models will be commoditized in some way. And I mean, they're already being commoditized. And if, let's just say, for example, the hyperscalers are able to pull ahead dramatically of open source, they're not, I think, going to be able necessarily to corner all use cases, because there are some things for which a step change above model may do better than a like generation behind model. However, if the open source community needs to specialize on going deep into a particular niche by fine-tuning and pairing a decent open model with a data set, I think that could be something that the open community is really good at doing and really well positioned to doing, because the hyperscalers, if you know that just by throwing more money at building more build out, and you don't need to get creative around network structure and incentivizing curation of high quality data, which I think the open source community is better at doing anyway, and just buy more GPUs, buy more, like I think that's going to be good at being a good base, but we don't need to regardless of whether that happens, I think the open source community has huge advantages and opportunities if we can get that high quality data pipeline that is crowdsourced. We're going to be able to do things that the hyperscalers are just not well positioned to do.
Interesting. When you talk about the data pipeline, I mean, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is, I mentioned that we're both obviously involved with Nostr. One of the things that really interests me about Nostr is the sort of open flow of information. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Nostr, you have a public-private key identity, posting messages just signed JSON, which is very important in a world where AIs can generate anything and you don't know who's generating what, to a free market of relays. And so as long as at least one of those relays is still hosting your data, you can access and do whatever you want with it. One of the interesting things that's stuck in my mind, I think maybe it was a tweet from Moxie Marlinspike, the Signal guy, where he was like, the big problem with AI today is not the actual AI or the models, but it's the lack of interoperability between the different apps and the data. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, I'm sure you have, but like Reddit now, you have to, sign in to see anything, which I hate. Twitter, you have to sign in to see anything. Like all these data sources, the new and potentially unique data sources, are going dark or paywalled. Whereas by building on potentially an open data standard like Nostr, potentially you could have much faster sharing of data, which for your agents is interesting, and also pair with Lightning payments, potentially the ability to incentivize reinforcement learning from human feedback or other kinds of data sorting or curation. Is that, you think, the interoperability of data and the ability to incentivize the crowdsourcing of data, is that our big, and when I say our, the open source community's advantage in the long run?
Yes, I think so. And it's in part because we are building a sort of substrate of connectivity, a market, a commons that is growing in network value faster than any company can. And I'm going to just read this. I found a tweet. I think it's the one you talked about from Moxie. He says, "It seems like a big limitation with AI agents right now isn't the AI. It's that the surface for software to interact with other software has gotten pretty small. Software on a phone is isolated to itself, and most modern services don't have public APIs. Agents would need to physically tap, question mark." I think there's two things. Number one is it's nice to have a substrate that we are starting to see more communications and economic activity moving to, that it's an open protocol, Nostr, as well as there's starting to be more attention paid to equipping agents, or one version of agents, these browser or browser automation agents that can make use of an existing login session or the types of access that you may have already and do interesting things vis-a-vis automation. Now, that would become a lot more valuable instead of if you had, let's say, some access to, say, some Discord channels of your own, and you're in 13 different I'm in a ton of different Discord channels relating to different AI projects, and I can't come close to staying on top of 1% of the information in there, even though I would like to. There's so much good information in there. But if I could make, with a few clicks, just take a little thing that can just, when I'm sleeping, like click through them in like a human-ish way and just collect the data. You could call it for my own personal use. I'm just, I'm not violating the terms of service. I'm just going to use it for myself. Like, just turning that into actionable data for me would be hugely valuable to me. But what if I also have a market where I can sell some of that data? And if I have that access and ability, and you have that access and ability, then every closed silo, maybe in the world, is potentially open, because there's just a demand for the data that's in there. And if you're the person with access to it, and you can say, oh, I'll take that information and reclaim it for the public commons, and like we're Robin Hood. We're taken from the closed silos, you're throwing it into the open, and you're getting paid a bounty. That seems like a sweet deal to me. We need that marketplace. And we are starting to be more in the inquiry, particularly as we look ahead to our medium and long-term roadmap for open agents, because yes, a limiting factor, at least for how we're approaching the market, is data, and we need an answer to that. We haven't announced this yet. Maybe I can do a sort of announcement here, is that we have made a deal with the team behind Spirit of Satoshi to acquire the rights to their data curation pipeline that they use to train the model of Spirit of Satoshi. So one thing that they did really well that I was really impressed by was they figured out how to build a web UI and kind of cultivate a community around responding to different prompts or questions. They basically built this whole crowdsourced data set of how you interact with a model that they wanted to be like a Bitcoin maxi, quote unquote, Spirit of Satoshi, and have a certain ideological bent on certain things. And they use that data to create a model. And at least as of now, you can use that model on openagents.com, Satoshi 7B. But the more interesting part of that to me was that pipeline of like, I would love to take that interface, and this is what one thing we're going to do probably more toward Q3 of this year, is what if we had that kind of pipeline paired with Lightning Sats that could be used to train any model, and maybe that there's a company that they really want something custom where instead of them going and paying OpenAI their bare minimum of like $2 million to get some kind of white glove concierge training. Like, well, here's like a good enough version that you can get from the community for $500. And like 80% of that money is going to filter out to the contributors. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. Increasingly, so we've obviously kind of hinted around this a little bit with open agents. The way it works today, you obviously have these chat models that people can use, which are, I guess, the ability to use open source ones, uncensored ones, or you can use OpenAI or whatever you want. And increasingly, you're now having people build open plugins that can plug into these models. What is your kind of like long-term view for where this marketplace goes? Is it, the ability just to compose lots of these modules together kind of in a lane chain type way? Is it, going to be more like a Hugging Face where you're hosting a bunch of these models? Like, what is your view for where this is all going?
What we want open agents to be for the end user is the one-stop shop where they get agents from. And know that whatever level of detail they want to dig into on privacy, on where data comes from, on, provenance of data, they know that that's all there and they can inspect it if they want to, or just know that the community is looking out and kind of has a verification system and rating systems to surface the best and highest quality models that they can feel confident integrating into their life, into their business workflows with different granularity of permissions. Like, there should be a one-stop shop for AI agents. We want open agents to be that. There will be a variety of different ways to engage. A developer is going to interact with it way differently than just a non-technical end user who just wants to have a particular thing in their life automated. So it should be as easy as, if you are an end user, let's just say that you want to have a certain level of, well, let's just say that you want to get a flight booked and you don't want it to be on a Boeing Max.
Yeah.
You should be able to just...
True story.
You should be able to just go to openagents.com, describe that. I want to book flights now. I have a flight coming up and also like forever with these filters, and I don't care, but like, here's my budget. Just here's my payment. Just figure it out. And then that gets figured out. And you don't need to trust that there's some shady Boeing.com website. It doesn't, like, there's no need to build trust about some random website, because you know that you can trust openagents.com. You can trust the community that we've built, knowing that there's thousands and then millions of eyeballs all working to surface the best agents for different use cases, building different components and rating the hell out of them and such. And so this is part of what we see is needed. There's been sort of this dichotomy, and I hear, there's this one interview recently, Logan Kilpatrick, one of the big like OpenAI dev guys who just left them for Google, had a great chat with one of the big AI agents angel investor, Yohei Nakajima, and they talked all about AI agents, and they really kind of cemented this dichotomy between generalist agents or niche specific agents. Like you either are trying to build broad and kind of solve something for all agents, or you're really niching down and getting proprietary data in. And this was just sort of like the trade-off. And my response to that is that's either a false dichotomy or that is thesis and antithesis for which we have synthesis, which is if you're able to stop all of the duplication, stop all the silo and everyone kind of like building these new things and building all these primitives themselves, and if you're able to build or compose agents out of reusable plugins and adapt them for a particular use case. Let's say you've got a particular idea about a particular filter that you want to apply to ordering airplane tickets. Maybe there's already an agent that does that same kind of thing that some other developers have already figured out how to interact with the relevant APIs. They added Expedia support. They added all the different top travel sites, and it like arbitrages between them in a way. And you're like, click, fork, add one prompt. Now it's yours. Now it does what you want. And what if you build a thing for yourself that other people want that same thing? And what if you get paid? You're getting paid for curation in addition to solving your own needs. Lots of stuff there still to explore. But that level of community creation and curation, I think is going to enable, I think what you've called long tail at scale. We're going to go niche, but we're going to do all the niches because we're incentivizing everybody to build the one market. What do you build the one market on? Do you build it on Ethereum? Do you build it on shitcoin of the day? Do you build it on proprietary technology that you don't share? You have to build it on open protocols. It's Bitcoin. It's Lightning. We can have debates about the layers and the eCash and the Nostr and the Web5. Doesn't matter. We're building on the Bitcoin stack. We are building the one market around the one money. You're either doing that or you're doing something else.
Yeah. There's obviously a lot of ground to explore with, I think, the rating systems and the curation. You know, I think you saw this. My most recent essay was called Noster's Identity for the Internet. And the thing that I'm becoming increasingly interested in is basically being able to take the same kind of reputation system you have in, like, you know, Yelp or Amazon or whatever, but because you have one identity that you can plug in anywhere, and that's one of the key features of Nostr, obviously, you know, you can bring that reputation with you. And so today I'm really excited about reputation in Bitcoin adjacent things, because obviously the core Nostr community is mostly Bitcoiners at this point, which I think is actually a feature, not a bug. But for things like DLC oracles, potentially, you know, cashew mints or feta mints, eventually local Bitcoins, which is, I know, one of your original ideas, those can all be, you know, rated, you know, using sort of Nostr identity and data store. Is that something that you see being powerful for the long tail of open agents as well?
Yes, we absolutely need very strong reputation. And it's also something that I think could well develop more rapidly between agents than between humans, because you don't need to convince a bunch of agents that they need to use a particular there's no behavior that you need to change. Like, we're building the agents. Any agents in our platform are going to use what we program into them. And Nostr absolutely is the logical substrate to use reputation for. Aside from my contribution to Nostr, my main one being writing NIP 28, the first public chat specification, I also wrote the first draft of NIP 32, and it ended up being renamed to labeling, but the first name for it was reputation. It was just like this idea that we should have very flexible, open-ended, key-based reputation with user-defined schemas. Until that point, there was people trying to build NIPs for like 1 to 100 reputation systems. Like, no, this needs to be more flexible. So I did like a placeholder draft. Someone eventually came back and like fleshed it out beautifully and made it a little bit more general purpose. Now it's called like labeling. But yes, this idea of any entity should be able to have reputation, and the reputation of an agent that does something that's user-facing or business-facing, or does something related to travel, or something related to you're granting something your personal permissions with your OAuth, and it's going to be doing things in the real world for you, summoning you an Uber and ease your real location. Like, all of those permissions need to be defined flexibly, sort of maybe at the application level. There'll be some things that are shared in common, some things that are use case specific, and like just being able to like kind of come up with your own loosely defined events that maybe gain community consensus in the process that Nostr has already developed with the event kind and stuff like that. Like, that seems just like the absolute logical substrate. And that there will be people who are more familiar with the sort of like Web 5 way of doing things and say like, well, Nostr's missing the key rotation to be able to do certain things securely to roll your keys, or like that might not have the level of, I don't know, I can't even like fully all make their arguments for them. But regardless of whether the current version of Nostr adds or evolves or is supplemented with other ways, everything that we're talking about, the commonality is we're talking about public key cryptography, where you and only you, or federations you trust or whatever, have the private key. The public key has metadata associated with it, and then systems that you interact with, AI agents, one of the clear ones, because the AI agents are going to need to know, are going to love to have all of the data about what's available to be able to act in the world. Key-based metadata is just needed to enable anything that we want.
Yeah, totally. I'd like to maybe move a little bit to a couple of philosophical questions. One, you know, it's very interesting because we've talked a lot about open source and why you're a big proponent of open source. Clearly, you're very passionate about freeing the data. On the other hand, we started off with, you know, you describing your work in the libertarian movement and Ron Paul campaign all around sort of private property. You know, it's interesting because I see in much of the Bitcoin, and frankly, even in some ways, even more in the Nostr community, this kind of like weird, not necessarily weird, but it's like, to me, an interesting overlap. You might call it anarchism, where you have almost anarchists from the right and anarchists from the left coming here. You said it yourself, a lot of what we're building on is commons. You could actually even think of Bitcoin as just commons money, Nostr is commons data or transmission. Where do you see the role for commons and, sort of left anarchism versus private property and markets, which maybe some would call right anarchism?
I don't know enough to steelman more of the sort of like left side of things, and when I say commons, I'm really meaning just like markets that are open, like open markets, and some good ideas from these books like Radical Markets, and just this idea that like any public good that you can envision, or quote unquote public good, is like markets are going to best supply that, and I think that Murray Rothbard in particular has done some of the most thorough work showing how even some of the most difficult, quote unquote, public goods like defense, policing, military can be done better via private competition. I think that those things are just increasingly going to play out. I think there is already a massive decline and degradation in what we'll call the fiat legacy system globally that's starting to seep into everyone's life, first through the theft of their purchasing power, second through what seems to be an increased pace of failing infrastructure, planes blowing holes out of it, like just there's just like a corruption and a rot. And I'm like gradually working my way through the audiobook of Atlas Shrugged, and it's like it feels a bit like that. Like we're starting to, the old system, let's say, is starting to lose mindshare because you've got some of the smartest people in the world building on Bitcoin. And though there are people that are trying to like kind of plug that into the old system or try to like help people along, what are we not doing? I'm not running for office. I ran for office in the past. I tried to be an inside the system guy because that's what Ron Paul was doing, and I'll register Republican and all. Nah, I'm not doing none of that. I'll build my own country. I've declared myself the sovereign of the nation of Atlantis. I'm going to build a whole fucking oceanic empire before I make a single change to a single American law. Or talk about all the stuff that has to happen.
I assume there you're referring to like the seasteading movement. Is that?
That's part of it.
Yeah. Interesting. So one, to kind of be clear on this, the way I think about this, my thoughts are still evolving. I think a lot of the definitions that we've even, come to associate with like left, right. I think a lot of that, frankly, is becoming a moot point, and things are just like evolving. And so what I mean by that is I do think, there is a place for the commons. I mean, and perhaps you could argue this is market driven as well, but Nostr or open protocols are commons in my mind. But in some ways it's at that level, almost like a stateless socialism, or it's a shared resource that you need for the markets to function. But it's radically different than what people would call quote unquote socialism or whatever in the last decade, because you don't need a state to do it. It can actually be done peer to peer. Similarly, on the market side, we have for the first time the possibility for true peer-to-peer markets on the internet, which I think is radically different than any kind of, other than like, obviously markets have always existed in that way, peer-to-peer in person, but that's never, I think once you change the scale of like one to potentially billions, that radically changes the nature of the market. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have particularly, strong ideological bents, but I do think that both corporations and nations as we know them are kind of 20th century. And it seems like free markets on top of open protocols, just to me seems like a new evolution, in its own direction.
I think that there has been interplay between market and state for the past however many,
Forever.
call it centuries, millennia, whatever. And you can now at least start to visualize a path for quote unquote society's needs to be met without a state, without government.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And between here and let's just call some more decentralized future or whatever, we still have states. And so I hope to see a lot more experiments, call it, like what Bukele is doing in El Salvador, what Milei is doing in Argentina, which is now like the first actual Austrian economist like running a major country. That's huge.
Although I saw a photo with him today with Sam Altman and the WorldCoin guys, so not sure I'm ready to get behind that.
There's all sorts of education that we laser-eyed people still need to do, and there will be rugs and people ignorant of things. And even though I think in the future there won't need to be such I don't know, heavy-handed governments like Bukele has been criticized, but I think that I would snap my fingers and have 100 more Bukeles than 100 more Kirchners or just the other sort of like general center-left globalist goop that we've had. So there may have in the past been roles for sort of like some government official to like use force to like create and protect a market where market forces can emerge. But we're I think thanks to Bitcoin, the game theory is playing out. Yeah, people who you previously might have thought would be the next authoritarian leader like Trump. I have never voted for Trump. I held signs in 2015 calling Trump a fascist, and I didn't vote for him in part because I thought he would be like most likely to start World War III. But it's like he didn't start any wars. We seem like we're inching toward that under the Democrats. And then you've got some of the most pro-Bitcoin, pro-libertarian, at least rhetoric. We'll see like how anything like that shapes up. I do think that this is sort of going to be like the Bitcoin election. And I think Bitcoiners may even help fill in the next cabinet. So it's like people who've been involved with open protocols for 15 years, we are exerting an influence over even the old systems that's only going to increase. My only fear is that old powers trying to keep their old powers intact may lash out or do something truly Orwellian. I arguably could say that the COVID lockdowns were like one set of steps in that direction. But on balance, I would say that the Bitcoin and Bitcoin sort of ethos taking root globally, I think we are going to be the largest driver of change and progress over the next decade. But there's going to be some fights to be had. I've carved out my lane here with the AI piece. I'm always looking for a good foil to draw contrasts with. 7 years ago, it was Travis Kalanick and Uber. Now it's Sam Altman and Satya. And that's the fight I'll be engaged in.
So I know we've been going here for almost an hour, so maybe one more big area I'd like to hit on with you, which is some of like zoom out for the commercial piece for even open source, like where AI is actually headed. I heard you on the recent Unchained podcast, which I thought was really nice. And, you were discussing a bit about what is the singularity. I think you maybe you called it something slightly different, but I talked about this with Kian earlier today. You've got Kurzweil, you've got some people I really like. I don't know if you know Terrence McKenna, who's like a famous consciousness explorer, psychonaut. He talked about an object at the end of history, kind of pulling people and accelerating or pulling ideas and pulling forces faster. Kurzweil calls it the singularity. It seems to me like they're talking about the same thing. And a lot of people have seen this. What do you think? I mean, definitionally, you can't see past the singularity, but what do you think is going to change about humanity in the next decade versus what's complete magical thinking versus what's just totally unknowable in your mind? And one thing I'll add for context for listeners who maybe not as deep in this, when I say singularity, it's often associated with AI, but I think it's part of a larger trend of compute gets radically cheaper and more powerful over time. Storage gets cheaper and more powerful over time. Energy gets cheaper and more abundant over time. Like all these things are happening and accelerating together.
Yeah, I had read Kurzweil's book Singularity is Near, and my assessment there is that a lot of that is directionally accurate, and the points about the increase in speed of human evolution. And I think some of the quote unquote singularitarians who think there's going to be some sort of consciousness merge and like will spread out through the galaxy, but as like these like gray goo robots, there's just a lot of weirdness there. I can assert what I hope to see, which I hope to see Star Trek. I hope to see a few centuries of like sort of peaceful spacefaring of the galaxy and exploring new worlds. My hope is that we are, within my lifetime, going to see an end to the institutionalized coercion that's characterized most of human history. And people can be liberated to make their own choices en masse. And we have enough sort of collective substrates, infrastructure that support humans operating effectively, building and growing civilization and evolving civilization with the coercion element removed. And I don't think humanity is going to truly evolve into its true potential until that coercion element is removed. I see the top-down coercion as like a cancer or something that has to be rooted out before humanity can do what the next thing is. I don't predict that there will be some crazy like melding into machines. I hope to continue relating to technology as tools that fundamentally augment human agency. I do not think that machines have consciousness or will have consciousness regardless of how intelligent they are. I think these are all properly related as tools to improve human agency, and hopefully they help us cooperate so that we can do cool things like ascend the Kardashev scale and expand throughout the universe and explore new worlds and stuff like that. I'm rewatching Star Trek Discovery now, so
I can tell.
I want
That's
the
great.
science in that.
Two questions that popped up from there. Why do you think that machines, or let me ask this way: do you think that machines cannot be conscious? This is a debate Key and I were having earlier today as well. Or do you think it's just highly unlikely given the current state of the art? Like LLMs are obviously one tiny advancement. I would argue they're not conscious or anywhere near it. Do you think it's physically possible, not possible? What's your view on that?
My short answer is I think that humans are uniquely conscious and our tools will not become conscious. I just view, and call it, I don't know, dumb spiritual religious belief or something, but like there's a spark that humans have that machines are not going to have, regardless of how good they get at emulating us, empowering us. I just don't believe in that sort of animism. But I do believe that they will play a crucial role in helping us as humans get to know each other better, work with each other better. There may be some sort of like communal intelligence, collective intelligence that emerges as the like bandwidth between people is able to be decreased. I'll be curious to see how these sort of like brain computer interfaces that Musk is working on kind of will play into that equation. So I think that technology will fundamentally help humans evolve to the next step. And the technology will be an important enabling role in that, but I don't view them as something that's going to replace us, or at least I'll be fighting against that.
Yeah. In terms, I mean, obviously the reason I named my fund Hive Mind is I'm very much bullish on this idea that all the pieces together become a new whole. That's the way evolution has always worked. Do you have any ideas? I mean, you mentioned, I guess, Star Trek as your vision, but if we have, close to zero latency communication between each other, mentally and potentially with billions, trillions, whatever of bots, what are some things that you think that could enable? Like, what paint the optimistic vision of that future? And I also would assume as part of that, you probably don't want a single corporation controlling that infrastructure, which gets back to my point on the commons and open source and open protocols.
No, absolutely. I mean, I want if the universe is like a big MMO sandbox, like I want to be able to make a group, make a guild, and go strike off into some unknown new direction and explore the end game content that God made for us that no one else has seen before. Like, let's just go do new things. Like, I just hope to see life multiply and consciousness expand throughout the universe. And, the starting point of that is kind of the stuff Bezos talks about like, let's have 1 trillion humans. Like, we can fan out all around Earth in O'Neill cylinders and get our 1,000 Einsteins and get our 1,000 Mozarts and, solve the problems that have been plaguing humanity to this point. But yeah, like Kardashev Ascent, like let's just get to level 3 before we like do anything else. Yeah. That'll keep us busy for a few millennia.
That's a very fair point. Cool. What else? Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure we touch on? Anything exciting for you? Anything top of mind?
My prediction is that every person, every family, every company, every enterprise will have one or more AI agents working on their behalf or as part of their business processes, essentially by the end of this decade, or at least that's when I expect the bulk of the penetration of this to happen. But fundamentally, it needs to be upgrades for people. And I'm excited to have a community, like the Bitcoin community broadly, being a group of people that I like. I just think that there's a level of integrity and intelligence and curiosity and like knowledge applied in this community. And I want to empower you people listening to this. We are in the hunt actively always for use cases / ways to increase, improve, upgrade your life. A bunch of the problems that we're focused on right now are around how do we have agents help in the software development process, because I'm a developer, my team is mostly developers, and our community is largely developers, and we're kind of scratching our own itch. But if you have anything that you think that AI could help you with, my question I love asking people is, if you could wave a magic wand and have some magical AI genie, AI agent, do something for you, anything, what would that be? Every time I've asked that question, everything everyone's responded to has been technologically possible to build. Cool. Let's just take what you want with developers who have the ability to build it, and let's just build that market. We'll be upgrading each other real fast, and this may accelerate all of these changes that we say are needed.
Amazing. Well, for starters, the travel booking agent, you said, I'll sign up for that. So
it's on the list.
Beautiful. Well, thank you, Christopher. Appreciate you coming. And this was a lot of fun. We'll have to do another chat to see where open source is at in a few months.
Thank you. Cool.
All right. Bye-bye.